study social change, and I'm totally into the topic of social change. And in fact, I knew as a kid that I wanted to, that my whole life was about change, just because I changed everything all the time. So social change works really well for me. And I remember reading about, I forget which book this was in, but about Komatsu, the heavy equipment manufacturer, what their strategy was to compete against Caterpillar, their major competition. And what they said was, we're going to surround Caterpillar. And so that's the approach I take to social change. I'm trying to surround it. I'm trying to get every aspect of it in some way. So lots of projects, all sorts of different kinds of things. So in terms of who, I've looked at social entrepreneurs. I've looked at sustainable entrepreneurs and regular entrepreneurs and institutional entrepreneurs. I've looked at change agents within organizations. I've looked at marginalized actors. I've looked at high power actors. I've looked at trade associations and field conveners and things along those lines in various different organizations. And trying to really try to understand what are the strategies that different actors have available to them, how can they use them in order to make change, how do they build coalitions, how do they compete, and what happens when they compete, what are the change outcomes under various situations with different change agents and different strategies. I've studied when people make change. So I think early on looked at boundaries, but I'm continuing to see this as a big part of my work, actually, where you end up in situations where organizational fields overlap. So you might have had a particular jurisdiction covered by one field, and then suddenly another field moves into that space, and you have competing conceptions. So we talk about complexity, we talk about plurality, talk about hybrids. So what happens when these fields start to overlap and you have these very different conceptions, these boundary shifts? But also we see value shifts in society, in organizations, among people. And often that contributes quite significantly to social change if they can create some resonance for those value shifts, either emotional resonance or cognitive resonance or whatever they can do in order to get people interested. And of course, we've got the usual technological change, climate change, all sorts of things that are driving shifts in various fields. And when you look across fields, you can actually see how the influences get interpreted in different ways by different people. So I'm not one of those institutional theorists that says it's all exogenous shocks, that institutional change happens because of exogenous shocks. I think there are lots of shocks out there, and only some of them make them into fields, and it all depends on the interpretation processes of the actors inside the fields and what they're doing. Temporality. My most recent paper, which I just got a note, was published yesterday, looks at temporality as a strategy, actually, time shifts and how you can actually use temporality to adjust change. Of course, Bill's on team his work. I also look at how different change processes unfold, and this is probably the thing I have spent the most time on, and all the others are the accoutrements that go with this how question, right? Is it a contested process? Do we have a social movement that's actually trying to convince an industry to make changes? Do we have different solutions that are competing for dominance? Do we have different certification systems that are trying to get as many adherents or coalitions together as possible in order to win the battle? Or can they get an arbiter involved who can choose one way or the other? Or more collaborative processes. For example, in the Dutch sustainable tourism industry, we had a trade association that actually reached out under threat, so threat is important, I think, but reached out to some relatively unorganized social movements, got them together and said, how can we do sustainable tourism? What is it that we can do to work together? So these collaborative processes exist as well, but under what conditions do they work better than the more contested approaches, and work better for whom? Right? There's always the different outcomes, the trade-offs that show up in this as well. Negotiated processes where groups get together to say, we want to solve this wicked problem. We need to figure out how to address it. And so what can we all do together? How do we start speaking the same language? So Grace Fan and I published a paper in AMJ last year on water governance. How do you get people to disembed themselves from their home logic and become re-embedded in this shared governance logic, and dually embedded, because they still have to go home and talk to their colleagues in their own field as well. And then I have a paper looking at, you can make change as an entrepreneur, as a social entrepreneur. When do you see spillovers to other locations? When do you start to see things being picked up by others, or different solutions being translated into environments, that kind of thing. What changes? And of course, values change, norms change, frames change, practices change, rules, relationships, and power. And all of those things show up in my work. And where do they change? So again, this whole surround social change strategy, sometimes it shows up at the societal level. My Japanese housewives papers that look at, trying to make changes in society through social enterprise and social movement and political action. And sometimes frequently it shows up at the field level. I focus a lot of my work at the field level, and I think that fields are where a lot of the action in the world happens. They're social spaces that share norms, or that compete over norms, or really develop the set of practices and logics that are going to manage a particular field. A field of practice or community. And so lots of focus on that. And then, of course, change often originates within single organizations. And then how do we see that spill over and adapt to other organizations? And in addition, some organizations are actively trying to be intervenors, where they are making change in other contexts as a role. That is their line of business. They're trying to make institutional change. And individuals. Institutional theory, do we think about individuals? Well, there's this micro foundations move that's getting started, but you have to think, how much do individuals matter? How do we get people's minds to change? Is it strictly a field level thing? I think individuals play a huge role when you're talking about change. So just overarching, right now going forward for me, I've got several papers underway focusing on institutional intervenors. And by these, I mean organizations who are doing repetitive institutional work. So they exist for the purposes of doing institutional work. I've got one looking at the Ford Foundation, trying to bring, well, this is building on Yan-Fei Hu's work, or she's actually the first author on it, and she's an Ivey grad, and looking at bringing democratic institutions into China. So quite a fun paper, very interesting paper. Looking at another organization, it's Day is the name of the organization. They're the development arm of Desjardins, which is a cooperative bank in Quebec, and they go around the world and set up cooperative banks in impoverished places, working to empower people and set these things up themselves. And for me, this is a huge issue because it's it's this idea that these intervenors have to work really closely with local actors, but the actual change gets made by the local actors themselves. So empowerment, innovation, all kinds of things are happening in this area. Okay, lots of bridging, contextual bridging. Okay, I also have a bunch of projects that are looking at visuals lately and the emotions they engender, other projects that look at emotions, and reflexivity. How do you get people out of their ways of thinking and to think in other ways? Visuals help to do that, emotions help to do that. How do you stimulate that reflexivity? And then some issues on scaling. How do you scale impact? How do you manage to work up from one context into multiple contexts? Okay, so getting into the provocation, this idea that this is basically taken from one of my research sites. So this is not my model. This is theirs. It's a social movement, and they're trying to stop people from using plastic. And they realized that they couldn't fight the plastic industry because it's too powerful. And so they started by saying, how do we get people to own the problem, to feel like it's their issue, that they can handle it, that they can manage it, to take responsibility. From there, they can then move into influencing legislation, influencing companies, taking consumer action. So one of these very, very wicked problems, they take it from the individual side. In terms of the way I'm starting to think about this is provocation from me. How do we shift the rise of polarization, of populism, of fascism, authoritarianism? All of this stuff is going on all around us right now. And there are people all around with these hugely emotional attachments to particular attitudes and huge polarization. We've got to somehow get over that. So I'm hoping that some of the work on reflexivity and disembedding and emotions, et cetera, will play on that. And of course, tying into our theme here, how do we move fast enough on climate change in order to save the species? And again, I think we've got to pay attention to disembedding, emotions, reflexivity, all of that kind of thing.